live Swansea Geographers talk seminars. We've got an exciting schedule over the next few weeks for you. 5 live seminars brought to you by our experts at Swansea University. I'm Dr. Nick Felsted, a lecturer at Swansea University in physical geography. And our experts will be bringing you topics such as the cryosphere, migration and citizenship tonight, GIS, volcanoes, and then the carbon cycle and the impact that COVID-19 has had on the carbon cycle. So we've got some really exciting topics for you over the next few weeks. These will all be uploaded onto our Swansea Geographers A-level transition site, which has loads of resources for you all. So you can access those. And these are resources specifically designed to help you transition from A-level studies into university life. So these talks over the next few weeks are kind of the topics that our lecturers and academics are experts in, but they're also A-level syllabus specific. So you'll be able to see the links of what you're learning right now and then what you'll learn here at university. So on to tonight, our first seminar is brought to you by Dr. Angharad Stevens, who's a senior lecturer in human geography. And without further ado, I will hand you over to Angharad.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you to everyone who's joined tonight. It's really great to be with you. Welcome, noswaith dda. What I've prepared for the next 20-25 minutes or so is a talk that just takes you through some sample material from a level 2 course that I convene called Political Geographies. And I'm going to focus there on some issues around citizenship and migration, themes that you'll be familiar with from your A-level and that we engage also at different ways across the degree programme and indeed in postgraduate research in the university. So these themes are long-standing, and in the Political Geographies course, when I moved to Swansea in 2016, we were engaging these topics primarily through the refugee crisis of 2015, that saw the largest movement of people across Europe, the largest movement of people since the Second World War. So that issue is very much in the news, and I remember the students at the time being really inspired to want to help. Some of them who were trained lifeguards went to volunteer on Greek islands. So this course and this material was developed in that climate. But the issues remain very relevant today and are now being played out in relation to new topics, and in particular in relation to the COVID-19 crisis. So you may have heard in the news today and yesterday how there's talk of a new vaccination passport, for example. That sort of topic specifically takes us to questions of citizenship and migration. Will we need a vaccine passport to be able to cross international borders? There's another way in which the COVID-19 pandemic engages questions of citizenship and migration, and that is on whether we're going to share vaccines with other nations across the world. So Jeremy Farrar, in this interview with the British Medical Journal, Jeremy Farrar is currently the head of the Wellcome Trust in the UK, has called on us not to have a kind of vaccine nationalism. That's what he's calling it, where we store and keep vaccines to ourselves and not share them with poorer countries. So these are some really interesting ways in which questions of citizenship, migration are intersecting with COVID. And I'm going to talk today primarily about questions of refugees, asylum seekers and migration. Although in geography, as you will all know, migration can refer to the migration of people, as well as birds or germs or viruses or animals. I'm primarily interested today in the movement of people, which is a really core topic in human geography. So these are some of the key concepts I'm going to be referring to. So to migrate means simply to move from one country or region or place to another, to settle in another place. Citizen will also be a concept that you're familiar with. So you can become a citizen in most countries in the world, either because you were born there by chance or through naturalization. So you can apply to become a citizen. Possibly you may have worked somewhere for a significant amount of time or contributed to that new political community in other ways. But citizenship also refers to kind of sets of rights and responsibilities and duties that we feel to our political community as well. So one example of that is how we might be called to serve on jury duty from time to time. This happened to me last year. So you're asked, as a member of the political community, will you come along and play your role in a case that's in the court of laws at that time. That's an example of how we have to play our part in terms of citizenship as well. So migration, citizenship, these are key concepts. And the question that I want to address from different angles is, how might we imagine citizenship beyond the nation state? So citizenship is a contract with the state across the world. So you get certain rights and responsibilities. So in the UK, you might get access to the NHS, for example, through citizenship, access schools, and so on. But we also have obligations, as we know, as geographers, to the world as a whole or to the planet. So the very meaning of the term geography means to write about the world. So in our discipline, we are intimately concerned with looking at the world as a whole. So one of the questions we're asking in this course, but we also ask throughout different topics in our discipline, is how can we think about something like citizenship, not only in relation to our own political community, but also in relation to a world community or a community of international citizenship or the planet. So citizenship for many of you might not be something you've thought much about. It may or may not have impacted you personally. Perhaps your family have had to apply for citizenship or know people who've had to. But mostly I tend to refer to this index, the passport index, to get us to think a bit about kind of how citizenship is unequally distributed. So this is not so clear to see, but if you can zoom in, what they do is rank every year just how powerful your passport is. So the countries at the top include Japan, Singapore, Germany, and at the bottom we have Afghanistan down there. It's just compiled on account of how many other countries you can easily travel to on the basis of your passport. So it obviously makes a difference what kind of citizenship you carry, whether you've got a passport that allows you to travel more freely than other kinds of passports. So some questions and the structure of the talk in general. In order to engage with this theme of citizenship beyond the state, I'm going to touch first of all on some facts and emerging questions from that context of the 2015 refugee crisis. Secondly, I'm going to look at some representations of refugees and migrants in the media. So that's something that we also pay a lot of attention to, looking at how news channels, documentaries, also social media tend to represent and talk about refugees and migrants, and what are the implications of some of those representations. And then finally, we'll try and wrap up by asking what might all this mean for thinking about citizenship. So there are three parts, if you'll stay with me. And if at any time you have questions you want to ask, or there are things you're not clear about, please put them into the Q&A, and I will address any questions at the end. I'll take questions, Nick will take questions too. So questions about the talk, about these themes, or about university life more generally, go ahead and put them in the Q&A. Okay, so to take you back 5 or 6 years ago to the 2015 refugee crisis, which we can look back now at with a degree of perspective and also with large amounts of data as to the crossings that people were undertaking, the journeys that people were making at this time. So the greatest tragedy of the 2015 refugee crisis was just how many people died trying to make their way into Europe. And that's what these figures gathered by a project that you can look up online called the Missing Migrants Project. It's run by a branch of the UN that seek to collect the data around the number of people who tried to make journeys into Europe and who tragically died trying to cross, mostly in boats or in unstable dinghies and so on. So these are the fatalities as we look back from 2014 to 2021. You can see that the columns in the lightest blue refer to the year 2015. So that was a particularly deadly year, a tragic year in terms of number of people who died. And this month, April in 2015, was particularly tragic. In 2015 as a whole, 3,770 people died trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea into European countries. What we know from the data that the Missing Migrants Project has collected is that this Mediterranean route has turned out to be one of the most deadly journeys in the world for refugees. So of all the refugees crossing international borders in Africa, Asia, all sorts of different parts of the world, far more are dying in this route in the Mediterranean than anywhere else, which is a striking statistic. So the Missing Migrants Project has been collecting data and visualizing that data in different ways. And I've included their website at the end of this set of slides where you can follow and look up the different data. But social scientists have also gone about addressing this crisis in other ways. So as well as collecting the data, they've been collecting people's stories. So I want to share with you here a project that a colleague of mine, Professor Vicky Squire, headed at Warwick University. So she was also tracking the journeys that people were making to cross the Mediterranean Sea by boat. And what she did was interview people in 4 countries in Europe. And she's collected many of the interviews and made them available on this website online. So if you think about the kind of work that we do in geography, it's already a kind of such a broad discipline, isn't it? A study of anything from volcanoes to migration. We also deal with different ways of accessing information. So from counting and studying the data to collecting personal testimony and stories. So here the people, a mother and a wife and a daughter, describe how they traveled to escape an authoritarian regime, for example. So what does all this data mean? Well, what's interesting when we kind of begin to unpack this subject of refuginess is that this category of the refugee only started to be defined in the mid-20th century. So the key date here is the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. Refuginess includes a really broad category of people. having very different life experiences, very different privileges. But before this kind of mid 20th century convention, very little attention was paid to the precise definition of what we meant by a refugee. People have always moved across borders. Yeah, we're mobile people. People have always moved from one place to another and settled in different countries. People have always also, at times of crisis, been forced to move across borders. But as those borders have tightened and become more heavily regulated and policed under the state system in the 20th century, then we see that crossing borders also becomes a huge problem for states. So it becomes a case of an emergency if there's no safe passage for people to get from one place to another. So what I'm trying to get at here is the connection between the movement of people and those borders that make it difficult for people to cross. It's the system of passports and citizenship, if you like, that we were referring to earlier. So if I may then move on to the second kind of core theme I want to touch on tonight. It's about representations of refugees. How do we see these people? How are they photographed? How are they talked about in the media? I first became interested in this back in 2012, 2013, when the Leveson inquiry was underway in the UK. That inquiry was about press standards and a kind of level of standards that should be expected of journalism. And one of the points that Lord Leveson raised was that refugees and asylum seekers often get spoken about in printed newspapers in disparaging ways or in dehumanizing ways. And that Leveson inquiry urged newspapers to do a better job. But academics, including Peter Nyers, who works in Canada, in his book Representing Refugees, also points out that these images of refugees are far more prevalent than the reproduction in print of anything that a particular refugee has said. So we tend to see these visualizations more than we get to hear from these populations. So think back about that project where Vicky Squire collected people's stories and how important that is, maybe, to give voice to people's stories and to give more context to people's lives beyond the typical images that we see. So other political geographers, led by David Campbell and Emma Hutchinson in Australia, did this interesting project where they wanted to kind of look more broadly at representations of refugees in the newspapers, in the Australian example, in Australian context in particular. They looked at two prominent Australian newspapers over a period of months, listed here. And what they found two main findings, which are super interesting. They said that on the whole, all the representations of refugees and asylum seekers during this period tended to capture them in large groups. So you really had a picture of one face, like my face here in this webinar screen, or two people. They tended to be photographed as masses of people arriving at a border together. And the second finding was that these pictures were often taken at a distance, which meant that you couldn't make out any particular facial features. So you couldn't get at the particularity of a person. Like I'm looking at Nick now, you know, the particularity of Nick in his profile there. These pictures would be taken from such distance that would kind of blur people's individuality, if you want. So these were the findings as they collected them, that the images were primarily of them as medium or large groups. Often we looked at boats, but from a distance. And it was only a small number of images that depicted any clear facial features. So they summed up that we see no faces, we see no real people, we just see anonymous masses. So this was a really interesting study, raising some questions for us as political geographers. Some of those questions then include what impact does this have on the way in which we hear about and learn about refugees? What are the implications of kind of seeing these masses of people on the way in which we think about forced migration? Does it mean that does it mean that we see these populations, these movement of people as a problem rather than as something that has always gone on, that people have always had to cross borders and always had to flee in times of war or hardship or poverty, or in the future potential climate disasters? And what are the implications of some of these images then on how we think about citizenship too? So how does it potentially contribute to ideas about us and them, about communities over here and over there, and certain people being seen as the problem for us over here? These are the kinds of questions that we talk about in political geographies. So to move on to the third and final section for the last 5 minutes, what does all this mean, okay, for thinking about citizenship? Well, many of the academics writing about citizenship today are raising questions about how we might imagine citizenship beyond the state. That kind of geographical challenge I was talking about earlier. These academics include Engin Aysin, who's written a great book called Citizens Without Frontiers, so without thinking in terms of borders, or without concerning ourselves only with our political community. And these are some photos from students and a student group who went to Calais in 2015 to try and take goods to people who had fled Syria as part of the 2015 refugee crisis. So that's the kind of conceptual issue that we're dealing with. How would we talk about and theorize and understand these initiatives, such as the students were showing here, of wanting to extend our care for others, our sense of obligation for others beyond state borders? And another way in which people are trying to address this is through community initiatives, such as you may or may not have heard of the Cities of Sanctuary network in the UK. So Sheffield was the first city to declare itself a city of sanctuary. A network of local people got together and said that they couldn't control what happened at the border, but if new refugee or asylum seeking communities were to settle in Sheffield, then they wanted to extend a welcome to them. And one of the nice facts about Swansea is that Swansea was the second city to declare itself a city of sanctuary in the UK. They did that in 2010. Now in 2016, Wales said that it wanted to be the first nation of sanctuary in the world. And this was a public meeting held at the Welsh Parliament to discuss what that might mean in 2018. So I've been kind of following these debates and interested in asking, well, what might it mean then to be a nation of sanctuary? They're trying to still figure this out in the Welsh Assembly. But there are also initiatives trying to figure this out at a university level. So several universities in the UK are currently planning or have already achieved a status as a university of sanctuary. And Swansea is one university that also has a working group on this at this current moment. So very final slide before the further references. these examples of Wales trying to think of itself as a nation of sanctuary or of different community groups extending care across borders, they challenge that conventional approach that says that citizenship is something that concerns our rights and obligations and memberships within the state only. They challenge that by trying to think about connections between states, across states, and between different people in various parts of the world. That's how it also relates back to this question of migration and the movement of people. So here, to conclude, I've listed these readings that you can, where you can follow some of these links, read more about this topic. If you want to cite any literature in essays coming up, I would really recommend these. I've only listed open access essays, so things that are freely available for you. They're not behind any paywalls. And Nick will explain more in a moment, but we have this open course site in the geography department where we put lots of materials concerning that transition between A-level and university. And this talk today with the slides will go up on that website. So you'll have this material available if you want to visit it. Okay, thank you for your attention. And we're going to turn now to questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Angharad. That was really interesting. It's a fascinating talk. And it's on a subject that we generally don't hear a lot about. We hear it from the perspective of the media. But to hear that kind of insight is really fascinating. We'll go through some questions, comments first. We had a comment in the chat from Libby saying forced migration may lead people to think they're not adding anything to the host country, as they may not necessarily be high-skilled workers.
Yes, thank you for that question, Libby. You know, your point about forced migration, that's an important term in itself, isn't it? So that's not something that people have chosen. It's something that people have, a journey that people have had to make, or a family have had to make, to flee war or persecution or whatever the issue might be. But you're also right that countries in Europe in particular, but also in North America, tend to talk about people in terms of the kind of contribution that they might make. And that's often tied to how much money they might earn or how highly skilled they are. But of course, there are all sorts of different contributions we might make as well, aren't there, beyond kind of highly paid work or particular training. Your point also just ties into that question of representation, I think, which is a topic in political geography, but also in social and cultural geographies. Just how do we talk about different people? How do we represent different people? How do these people get talked about in the media or in social policy? And that's something that we can study through textual analysis. And then if we have an interest in policy, it's also something that we might want to try and change by building up evidence or suggesting other ways in which we might represent and engage others, such as, you know, again, Vicky Squire's project of recording people's stories. So more about the economy rather than culture and diversity. Yes, do you know, your question also just makes me think about the COVID pandemic, and I've had to apologize to my students this year that I keep kind of finding examples in this pandemic. But this experience of the past year has, I think, initiated a whole societal conversation, hasn't it, as on what kind of work we value. So those cleaners in the hospitals or the nurses in the hospitals who are often migrant populations who've come to work in the NHS from other countries. these are not the most highly paid professions, and I don't know how they're ranked in terms of their skills, but I think we have had a kind of national conversation, haven't we, in the UK anyway, about maybe revisiting what kind of work do we value, what kind of work do we consider to be key. And then thank you for the link that you've sent. I can't click on the link at the moment. Maybe you have a look at that.
It's a really interesting insight, kind of photographs of people in transit.
Oh, great. Thank you. Do you know another topic that's interested me and that I've encouraged lots of students to pursue for their projects is that there have been lots of kind of artistic engagements with the refugee crisis. So you may have heard of the artist Ai Weiwei. He's a Chinese national, but has been living in Berlin most recently because he's been very critical of the Chinese government. He moved his artist studio to the Isle of Lesbos in Greece in 2015 to document the crisis in his artworks, and that's led to kind of large exhibition pieces of his, but also lots and lots of other artists have also engaged the crisis and kind of tried to represent it in other ways, you know, to bring another representation. So I met one artist who'd been working, taking Polaroids of people as they came off the boats and giving the photograph to these people and saying, you know, I've recorded your journey for you. So there's lots of interesting stuff around art and different images of that crisis that haven't really been collected or documented fully.
If there are any other questions or comments, please do put them in the chat. But I just wanted to ask you, Angharad, about what other subjects are taught in political geography?
Well, in political geographies, we go through different kinds of crisis, so different politics of crisis. So this theme of kind of ideas about imagined communities of us and them is a theme that runs throughout the course, but we engage with crises ranging from migration to terrorism and security, going from the events of 9/11 to recent terrorist attacks in Europe. We also do citizenship, identity, austerity has been a big topic since 2010. And then questions of resistance as well. So what kind of examples of social movements do we see across the world who are trying to forge a different kind of future? So yeah, lots of different things, and it tends to change with the year that I'm teaching it in terms of what are the main topics in that year. So some things become more important than others. And no doubt by next year I'll have to develop some stuff on the COVID pandemic. Brexit, of course, has been a big issue for several years, although I got sick of talking about that. After a few years, it was just so depressing. I couldn't even, yes, but that's been an also a key topic in the course, Brexit and its implications.
Yeah. So a really broad range of different topics.
Yes, and that's taught at level 2. It's taught at level 2 in Swansea, but also you'd see that in most geography departments. So most geography departments, you'd have a kind of broad introduction to human geography topics, including cities, movement of people and goods, sense of place, how people live together, why people can't live together, borders, violence, you know, the general human geography themes in the first year. And then in the second year, wherever you choose to go, you'd probably specialize a bit more in some political geography or cultural geography, GIS, specialist courses, and then in the third year become more specialist again.
We've had a comment in the chat.
Yeah, well, you know what your point, is it Pordy? I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly, but do correct me, because I know with my name what it's like to have people mispronounce my name. Okay, good, thank you. I think your question is really helpful for reminding us of how this is not new, is it? The representation of others, or those seen to be at the bottom of society, or those seen to be as a drain, quote, on society. We've always, as societies, othered a certain community, kind of established ourselves as different from them, whoever they might be at different times. So it's interesting to track how who those communities are has changed over time. There's a really great book that we look at by the anthropologist Arjun Appadurai, and he puts it in a really nice way. He has an essay called Fear of Small Numbers. That's the title of the essay. And he just asks, why is it that we fear the smallest group, the weakest group in society? So the people who have the least. Why is it that they become such an object of fear and rage? That's Arjun Appadurai's question. Really love that question. It's very thought-provoking, and it's one that I teach, and I use that essay a lot at level 2. He's written some great essays on this crisis as well. So I'll type his name into the chat. He has an article in a journal called Eurozine, which I know is open access, so anyone can access. I like the Said stuff. Do you mean the Edward Said? Because Edward Said, yes, would be very relevant figure for you to read here. So one of the founders of cultural studies or sociology, and who wrote a hugely influential book in, I think the first issue was 1978, Orientalism. And in Orientalism, he talks about how communities imagine themselves as different from them. He was talking about how the cultures of the West do this by distinguishing themselves against the East. And, again, I'm coming back to the COVID pandemic. Think of when Donald Trump purposefully described COVID as the Chinese virus. Yeah, that was such a perfect example of what Edward Said described as Orientalism 40 years ago. More general question about field work. Thank you, Libby. So normally we go to New York, Vancouver, or Berlin. I happen to go on the Berlin trip, a city I love very much, and I've been taking students there since 2007. Obviously, last year we were unable to go, and that was so desperately sad for our students. But this year, for those students who've missed out, we have developed a really exciting set of local field trips. So they have a choice of 12. We've all been working really hard at them, and they're going canoeing on one day, or they get to travel to the Brecon Beacons. They're going to the city centre to look at urban atmospheres and regeneration and the economy. There's a chance to visit an old asylum hospital. There's a real range of stuff that we've come up with in response to the pandemic, which is running this year. So the fieldwork abroad, the fieldwork modules are their own specialist modules. So they're not on a particular subject, they all run in relation to that particular city. So with Berlin, we have a set of projects on the politics of memory, for example, memory and borders. Attempts to remember and commemorate is a huge topic in Berlin. There are other topics that are engaged in Vancouver, including indigeneity and also glaciology. So the Vancouver one combines physical and human elements. And I'm sure we're all looking forward to be able to travel again to these places. Although I'm sure also that with all of the work that's gone into these local field trips, that some of that will remain, you know, and there's no reason why it shouldn't. So that stuff has been exciting to develop, and we'll have to move forward thinking about how we combine some of the international travel with deep local knowledge as well.
We also, in third year, the Indian Himalayas, where culture and language is a huge part of that trip, investigating the indigenous populations of an area of northern India called Sikkim, which sits between Bhutan, Tibet, and Nepal. So there's a huge Nepalese influence and a huge influence from Tibet, as it's where the Dalai Lama fled Tibet into India down through Sikkim. So there's a big Buddhist presence in Sikkim, and we investigate the culture and language and how these cultures and languages have come together in this kind of melting pot that includes huge biological diversity, foothills of the Himalayan mountains, and then the zoological and the floral and faunal aspects, and how this influences the culture, language, and religion of the region. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A. So there have been some studies by LSE that suggest migrants are actually more entrepreneurial. Is that something you've seen in other studies?
No, I haven't seen that study, but thank you for drawing my attention to it. It wouldn't surprise me, just from the number of languages that migrants have to learn very quickly, as just one example of entrepreneurialism, yeah, and skills building. And about the migration of birds, I don't know anything about the migration of birds. I'm sorry, I can't answer that.
That's good thinking outside the box.
But yeah, and that would be another brilliant topic. Has kept me going in this lockdown as well, going to see the starlings collect on the seaside at around 4 or 5 p.m. They all gather there, and they're so beautiful and noisy. I'm currently doing an independent investigation into the regeneration of my local area. Interesting. Is there a chance to study specific areas of the course further at university? How much further research can we do into the topics? Do you mean, is there a chance to study regeneration further? Because that is a core theme. I mean, yesterday I was in the city centre filming actually for our digital field trip. And one of the topics we were engaging there was regeneration through theatres and small-scale cinemas and creative shops that have opened on the high street. So rather than think of regeneration as involving only those kind of big building projects or multi-million-pound projects, thinking of them through a small-scale initiatives as well. So if you're referring to, is there more around regeneration? Absolutely there is. So we have a strong kind of economic geography staff component at Swansea. So there's elements of economic geographies and the geographies of finance that run from level 1, 2, 3, and obviously there are huge connections there between that and political geography. And you're encouraged at all levels to do further research. You know, the independent, in terms of independent investigation, this is one thing that's very particular to geography. So some of you may be undecided at the moment. Are you going to carry on with geography or switch topics? But I think one of the things that employers are really impressed by in terms of our geography graduates is that they have all completed an independent investigation, an independent dissertation by the end, which is 7,500 words long. And they've led that themselves and discovered stuff and written about stuff themselves. And it really is an impressive thing to be able to show an employer that you've self-led that study. And I know in politics departments and sociology, there's an option to do that kind of work, but it's one of the features of geography in the UK that all the students do it. And I really think that's a strength of the discipline.
So yeah, is there a dissertation available to do as a module? Yes. In our third year, you'll do your dissertation as a module, and there's an accompanying support module that goes with that. So you'll be assigned a supervisor that will effectively coach you through your dissertation, but it's for you to come up with any idea that you want, as long as it's feasible. You can do whatever you want for your dissertation.
Yeah, so we're just starting that process now, aren't we, Nick, at level 2, with people thinking about their topics and stuff ranging from wildfires to fans of darts and how fans of darts competitions travel across the country. So really, in geography, we capture a broad range of stuff.
All right, if there's no more questions, we'll bring this first seminar to an end. Thank you very much, Angharad, for your fascinating talk. And
thank you, Nick. Thank you to everyone who came. Thank you.
And before we leave, next week we will be joined by Professor Adrian Luckman, who will be talking about geographic information systems, a fast-growing area for geographers in higher education and the workplace. And that's sure to be a fascinating talk. All of these talks are going to be recorded and the lecture slides made available. To access our A-level transition page, if you go through the Hub website into the post-16 section, you'll be able to find links to additional materials, and under geography, Swansea University will appear, and it will bring you through into the right part of the website, and you can click through onto the Canvas course. So we hope to see you all again next week, and thank you all for coming.